Is there a secret sauce that goes into these bikes? Like, do you have like a little bit of craftsmanship that you put into it for that type of rider?
No, everybody gets the secret sauce, and I'm glad you asked that question because going back to the original conversation about the materials and the tools and the mood and the expectations, I feel like the human element, me, and the order in which I decide to go from like the beginning to the end and everything in the middle is something I've been working on for, at this point, 54 or 55 years. And that is really the secret sauce. It's the whole stew of uh, paying attention to
Mhm.
everything that's on my bench and realizing that even if something does go a little sideways, that too is part of the whole. And I think that um, the sum total of this is what makes the bike the bike.
Hey, welcome back to the New England Endurance Podcast. This is the show where we explore the clubs, events, organization, and companies that make up the endurance scene here in New England. And today's guest is one of the most respected names in American cycling craft. Richard Sachs has spent decades building bicycles by hand and helping shape a culture around racing, design, tradition, and community. And for longtime cyclists, his name means a great deal. For younger riders out there who may be hearing it for the first time, this is a chance to meet the person behind the bikes, the philosophy, and the legacy. So, Richard, it's a real honor to have you on the New England Endurance Podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Art. You read that just the way I wrote it. I appreciate that. Thanks.
I feel like I've known you for my entire cycling career, even though we've never met. I've seen you, at cyclocross events dating back to the 90s, early 2000s. My good friend Matt Kraus used to race for you.
Uh-huh.
Justin Spinelli, who was recently on the podcast, actually connected us. So I'm grateful for both of those guys, and I'm grateful for all that you've done for the community. Um, there's so many places we can start today. I guess first off, like, where are you located? Where do you make your bikes? And I'd love to just hear about your story. When did your company begin? So yeah, let's kick it off.
Well, I'm in Deep River, Connecticut. We've been here about 9 years. I moved to this area, one town up, Chester, in I think it was 1972, and watched the whole area evolve. And by about 2008, we were starting to suffocate on the how precious some of these river valley towns were becoming because they became some of them became like destination towns for like
Mm.
tourists and people who want to spend the day in the country or related. I came here for a job. I came here to live. So by 2008, when I had already been in Chester, the town that I had moved to originally, um, we decided to move to the woods in Franklin County, Massachusetts,
Mm.
uh, in a little town called Warwick, just maybe 15 miles east of Northfield. So we moved up there, and then we realized that isolation and solitude uh, is okay, but it's not always the answer. So after about 8 or 9 years in the woods, we moved back here. So I'm in Deep River, maybe a mile south from where it all began in 1972.
Wow. So you started building bikes in 1972?
Well, I went to England. I actually didn't want to be a bike maker. That was not my first calling. I ended up after a while being a bike maker simply because I stayed in the trade long enough to uh realize that any other ideas I may have had as like a an adolescent or a teenager no longer existed. So I stayed with it. But yeah, I started my business in 1975. That was after maybe 3.5 years of working for Whitcomb in England and Whitcomb USA in Connecticut, which is
Hmm.
the second company is how I ended up in Connecticut because I'm from New Jersey. But I went from New Jersey to Vermont to London to to this area and pretty much stayed except for the 8 years in the woods.
8 years in the way. I mean,
Yeah.
so you spent decades doing this, and I'm sure you're right. This is like a series we would need to do with you to uncover all the different stages of your career, which as an entrepreneur that I am, I would love to hear that story. But I'm just curious, how did you keep it going? Like, how do you find the work so meaningful year after year? What drives you?
Well, what drives me is that, to hopefully put this in a neat nutshell, is that uh, in, regardless of the sport or the industry or marketing or economy or anything, uh, what I do is make things.
Mhm,
What I happen to make is a bicycle frame. And while the bicycle frame has changed or evolved or in many cases devolved through the years, um, it's still for me an interesting challenge to, let's say once a week or maybe 5 or 6 times a month, begin the next order. So
mm,
whenever you have an order, that's when, I say this often, that's when nothing has gone wrong. It's basically the ideal. Anything that you have in your head that you want to translate into a three-dimensional object for the person like who commissioned you is what is at hand. But in spite of the fact that 5 decades plus have passed, whenever you pick up the material, whenever you start swinging tools, whenever you try to fabricate something that's in 3D form that in your head is basically a fantasy because you haven't made it yet, um, the idea is to make it exactly the way you thought you designed it in your head so that it fits your vision and also works well with the client who hired you. There's
mhm,
a lot going on. There's a lot of materials. There's heat. There's torches. There's tolerances. There's accuracy. There's mood. There's tools that are either sharp or need to be sharpened or need to be replaced. And when you get everything together and you start that next commission, let's say on Monday, if we want to keep things neat and tidy, um, by the time like the end of the day or Tuesday comes around, you realize that the human element or the human component of this makes it so that you end up having a conversation or a collaboration with your materials and tubes. It's not just that, oh, I'm Richard Sachs and I've made like thousands and thousands of these things. So it's predictable that like by Friday, it's going to be perfect and it's going to be exactly the way um,
yeah,
I wanted it and exactly what the client hoped for. But in reality, when you have all these variables and things come in different sizes and diameters and dimensions and
mhm,
tolerances, from the manufacturer, my job is to somehow find a perfect balance or an acceptable balance between all the ingredients that I have mentioned.
mm.
Uh, that is really what drives me. Um, and I regularly refer to it as trying to tame the beast because you have all the stuff and you have your tools and your mood and, the work order. And it's not like, you put this stuff in a form, you put some goop on it, and you let this goop dry, and then you pull it out of the form, and it's a frame that, you know, looks exactly like you planned. The variables and the challenge to, maybe eradicate the low points, um, these are what they drive me. It has nothing to do with, like, double-butted tubing or
Mhm.
TIG welding or carbon fiber forks or what, Wildfire Art rides or doesn't ride. I don't really care about the sport. I don't care about the industry.
Mm,
Um, what I do care about is my relationship with what's on my bench
mhm,
and the vision that I have in my head and um, trying to really drive things so that on Friday, if like I said, if you want to keep things neat and tidy, everything is the way it should be. And over time, I finally acquiesced to the fact that y- I'm in a working relationship with all this stuff, the tools, the pipes, the torches, the crap that I have to deal with if
Hmm.
assuming there is crap to deal with, everything, it's like a
Yeah.
chef and a bunch of, ingredients. You try to like meld things together, and before you know it, it's like, it's, hey, what happened here? It kind of went over here when you wanted it to be over here.
Yeah.
Or, this stuff dried differently than I wanted it, and it's not as moist as like all these things are what are the reason I continue. Of course, I have
Yeah.
loyal clients and a good demand for my products, and most people don't really do a deep dive into thinking about the question that you asked me, like, why does he do this? What drives him? But for me, it's like, um, uh, I need work. Everybody needs something to do after breakfast. And
Hmm.
for 54 years, this is what I've been doing. And, there've been high points. There have been some, mediocre points, but along the way, I just feel like, I know what to do. I just have to get to my bench and do it. And before you know it, it's time to start another one. And you look at the one you just finished and you think, so.
Yeah. It's like each time you have a clean canvas, like you're speaking like an artist, a true craftsman. I mean, for someone who's never seen your bikes in person, how would you describe what makes a Richard Sachs bicycle or frame distinct without getting too deep into the technical weeds?
Well, first of all, I I feel like at least starting in the early 90s, I realized that like the industry is over here and and perhaps guys like me are over here. The industry just wants to keep reinventing things and making
Hmm.
things more complicated and harder to service. I'm sure they don't do this deliberately, but from where I stand, it just looks like they've commodified every single part of the bicycle, and
Hmm.
now they've introduced batteries and like
Hmm.
Bluetooth and motors or whatever. So like I don't really care about that stuff. Um, I just I just feel like when I came into this, and like I said before, I didn't really come into this thinking I'm going to be a professional frame builder, but I was a teenager and I did have a 10-speed bike back in the late 60s, early 70s. And I was a bit fascinated with the fact that I thought they were kind of beautiful.
Hmm.
And the more I looked at them and the more I read about them, and, when started understanding that there's a sport that's built around things that I found beautiful, I was really interested in the like, I'll call it a construct that there are men in Europe, Italy, France,
Hmm.
Great Britain, Benelux countries, who, for their job, go to the workbench and they fabricate these things by hand for people who race. Because back then it was really unthinkable that you would go to a bike store and be able to leave with a bike that was manufactured for racing.
Hmm.
In those days, everything was handmade because there was no robotics, and automation really was in its infancy as far as manufacturing goes. So
Hmm.
even if you were looking at cheap bikes, they were made in factories by hand. They might have had workstations, and you know, I'm sure some people cared more about their work than others. But at the top of the, let's say, food pyramid of bicycle making back then, uh, it was the frame builders who really set the tone for everything, and to use a cliche, drove the bus.
Hmm.
And at some point along the way, I developed an affinity for this like construct. I still didn't want to. I still didn't think about going to Europe and becoming one of them, but I couldn't get it out of my head that these things were beautiful. There was a sport in Europe where, all the photos that I've seen in international magazines would just like draw me in. The colors, the vistas, the spirit of competition, and all of these people were riding bikes that were made by hand by people who were like called frame builders. And I never really lost that taste. So
Interesting.
my bikes, I think, are my interpretation of what I remember back when I was, let's say, 20 or 18 or 28, trying to channel the best I could, what I thought was actually happening in Europe. By then I had been to Europe a bunch of times and seen it firsthand, but there was still this like fantasy that if I work hard enough and long enough, I could be like some of these guys whose names were on the down tubes of bikes that I saw winning races. So that's what a Richard Sachs bike is. It has nothing to do with like I said before, non-ferrous materials or um uh wide tires or
Hmm.
all the stupid crap that they talk about these days.
So it goes without saying that your bikes are exclusively made out of steel, right? You're not doing any titanium?
I'm not doing anything except steel. I have my own tubing that I designed. It comes in five different variations. I have all my own fittings that I've been producing um, since about 1999, and I also
Hmm.
sell all these things to other frame builders if they want to make bikes for their clients that are kind of in the image of what we're talking about.
Oh, interesting.
Traditional steel bikes with forks that are made by me or whoever I sell this stuff to, and horizontal top tubes and no springs. So
But
yeah.
I mean, just a little bit of a tangent here, but at what year or what point do you think that the riders in the Tour de France, let's say, were no longer riding hand-built bikes, but more mass-produced?
Well, I'd probably nail it down to the early to middle 90s when
Hmm.
I'm going to do my best to like say this in a concise manner.
Okay.
In the 80s, the road market was like plummeting. Uh, it was probably plummeting because of saturation. I don't remember all the details.
Oh.
But in the wake of all that, the mountain bike, which was somewhat new in the late 70s, early 80s, somehow revitalized the bicycle business. So stores, while they weren't selling as many road bikes as they once did, they couldn't make mountain bikes fast enough. And then eventually, like, the the steam ran out for that market too. And all
Hmm.
these mountain bike companies that like never existed before 1980 was like, what are we going to do now? So somehow, like from my vantage point, I think they got the idea like, wow, like we could use all this manufacturing facility that we have and the tools and the workforce. We can make these road bikes. And
Yep.
before you know it, it's like, all these like mountain bike companies were putting their name on like road bikes. Everything back then was still like, horizontal top tubes. And
Hmm.
a lot of these companies never knew how to make forks in the first place because they probably, use rock shocks on most of their bikes. So that's when the aftermarket fork business probably started to grow. So all these bikes
Oh,
that we're
wow.
talking about that were made by like mountain bike companies had like aftermarket forks holding their front wheel. I never understood that myself, but um,
Hmm.
that's
Interesting.
a psychosis that I live with. But by the time it evolved or grew a little bit into the late 80s, most of those companies were not rooted in the conventions that European companies were. And they started looking around for like non-ferrous materials to maybe try, maybe to save money, to maybe improve the work that they're doing. They didn't embrace brazing the way, a generation before might have. So they thought
Hmm.
like, well, we can glue these things together or we can weld them or whatever it is. Now basically they put them in a big waffle iron and produce them so that they like one is like the 99 before it and the 2000 after
Yeah.
them. And there's like really very little variation. So I think that by the time a lot of these companies figured out how to actually manufacture a frame rather than make them by hand or with a like a human workforce, That's when the work that people like me that I do would begin to be supplanted by manufactured bikes. Whether you're talking about Trek or
Hmm.
Giant or God knows, all the other Stevens,
Yeah.
or Bea,
Hmm.
and by like Y2K, it was like, there's still probably a few people like commissioning a frame and putting somebody else's stickers on it. But I think that all ended by the time the 21st century started. So now we're like in 2026, and it'd be like ridiculous to think that a frame builder per se could have a a team or a group.
Yeah.
If I had continued in 2023 rather than like, shut down the team that I had been managing and sponsoring for like decades, I could have still been an example of like, well, these things can be raced and they can still, be under riders who get on the podium. But, for reasons that are unrelated to this conversation at this point, I just kind of decided to walk away from the sport completely.
Wow. Well,
So,
okay. So you just touched on something I sort of want to lead into, if you don't mind. So when I think of Richard Sachs, obviously I think of the frames, but I also personally I think of the someone who's a community builder. It seems like you've always had teams or clubs associated with your name. I'd love to start with the Connecticut Yankee Bicycle Club, CYBC. It has
yeah.
a super deep history in New England. Just for our listeners, this was in the 60s and 70s. It's my understanding that a bunch of great riders came through there. Like, how are you involved, Richard, in CYBC, and what made it such a fertile club for developing riders?
Well, when I moved to Connecticut from London, uh, it was to get a job at Whitcomb, USA, which is in East Haddam, like, maybe 10 miles from here. When I moved here and got that job, Whitcomb, USA was already sponsoring a local club. I
Hmm.
don't know the details of how that arrangement, originated, but working there, it was like, well, like I had already been racing in England and before that in Vermont when I was there for like one summer. So like racing was kind of like my identity. So, I went straight from uh like get off the plane, get a job, find a place to live, and my racing would be with CYBC. Um, Back then, we had some national class riders from America, one or two from Great Britain, and it was a small group, maybe 10 people at the most. But back then, also, the entire sport was club system centric. So
Hmm.
if you were interested in the sport, you would find a local club, uh, you would join it, and you would become part of their, small community. And I kind of fell into that hook, line, and sinker because we had a good group of guys. Whitcomb USA, my my boss, my
Hmm.
employer, did a decent job of keeping the riders supported and sustained and um, out of uh, out of poverty, if you will, and they kept going. So Whitcomb USA ultimately decided to walk away from sponsorship probably by the middle to late 70s. There were a couple of other sponsorships that kept the club going. And by the time I'd say 1980, 1981 rolled around, one of the riders who was more uh, active then asked me if I could use my business, which was now like in its fifth or sixth year, and become a sponsor. In other words,
Yeah.
we have no sponsors. Would you like to, come back into the fold and sponsor us? And I thought, like, sure. Like, they were there when I needed to be supported. It's only right that,
Hmm.
I step in. But ultimately, the CYBC thing became my identity.
I'd love to hear how this morphed into what I remembered was the Richard Sachs cyclocross team.
Oh, that's easy. I got into cyclocross when I was still living in England. We used to go to the weekend events, and for me, the culmination of all of that was uh, the year that I was there. The World Championships were in Crystal Palace, which is, I think, an area or a park in London. So I got to see, like, right there, Eric de Vlaeminck win his
Oh, wow.
I think seventh world championship, like right there in front of me. And like, in addition to like having spent a lot of the weekends going to the races, I just thought like that was the coolest thing because I was now watching people whose faces I'd see regularly in the European bike magazines. Um, and the needle was in my arm immediately. However, when I came back and we did all the road stuff with CYBC, um, even though I had like roots in cyclocross, there really was no scene to speak of. In the late '90s, well, maybe it was the mid '90s, I was sponsoring two teams again concurrently. One of them was the Nexa team that Margaret Wise, rest in
Hmm.
peace, ran. And it was basically a junior and a U23 development team. And she thought that all the kids who now have their own kids um, should ride their bikes all year long. So they got into cyclocross quite
Hmm.
early in the scheme of things. And I made a few bikes for them. I was really a road bike supplier to Nexa rather than a cyclocross. But ultimately, the relationships all change or end, and I decided to kind of double dip. I had a road team which was serious. We had pro-am riders for most of the '90s, and we were really good. I know it seems like yesterday, but most of the people who were listening to this might not have even been born yet. But I decided to kind of uh, like diversify into cyclocross by about 1997 or so, little by little, so that the teams that I was sponsoring, uh, they could do either road or cross. Most people didn't do both
Hmm.
back then. And before you know it, it's like the excitement and the um, the bang for my buck as far as support goes was in cyclocross was dwarfing what we were used to on the road,
Yeah,
and I just stayed with it. I think by 2001 I kind of stopped doing road stuff completely. Excuse me, there's a bug here.
no problem.
See ya. um and just did cyclocross for the next 22 or 23 years.
Does the team still exist?
No, it doesn't. In 2023, it's funny because over time, the sport and uh, c- it's it's the sport changed. The club system seemed to break down. I don't know,
Hmm.
somewhere along the lines. Let's just say early '90s, and before you know it, it's like we don't even know what the kids or the young people in my team. They didn't even know what CYBC stood for.
Hmm.
They didn't know the history of like how it started with some guy from my team asking me to take over the reins. They just knew that, we had this presence at like every weekend, and we were doing really well for a long time, and that maybe if they ask or wait, or if we have the budget or the room, they too could be part of the Richard Sachs cyclocross team. So RSCX became its own identity, but it's really it's really inseparable to me
Yeah.
from CYBC and the whole lineage that uh, precedes all this. So in 2023, after, like I said, 44 or so years, um, for many many reasons. I thought, like, uh, I think the term in the financial world is matured. The project matured to the point that we were starting to repeat ourselves. We were um, starting to not give back to the sponsorship program as much as it once uh,
Hmm.
was receiving, and people didn't really know. uh, how to reconcile that, because people got so used to the fact that every like August or September we'd roll around, and before you know it, we'd be at every race weekend like
Yeah.
everybody else, and then January we'd say, "Okay, see you next fall." But most of the mechanics behind the whole thing were my wife and I.
Mm.
My wife's name is Deb, and I'd be lying if I uh, it was at least 11 months of the year of organizing and
Wow.
hustling and
Yeah.
arranging and rearranging writers, sponsors, industry suppliers, finances. By the time like 2010 rolled around, the amount of support that we had was amazing. We had, I don't want to say so much money, but we had, we didn't really have too much to worry about as far as
Mm.
supporting the riders. So for about 10 years, things were going perfectly swell. We were getting
Mhm.
results, we were getting corporate sponsors. I was supplying the bikes, I was buying the clothing. 1 or 2 years we had a clothing supplier, so that kind of lightened my load a little bit.
Mm.
But for the
Yeah.
most part, this was all um, one long labor of love. And I think, COVID was really the tipping point for us,
Mm.
because we had a
Yeah.
full season plan, bikes were made, clothing was made, and then COVID made it so like we didn't have a schedule. So we had a whole season where the riders that we did have were the obligation that I tried to put them under was, in spite of the fact that we're not going to races, we still need you to do like reels or
Yeah.
storylines that relate to this project that we call
Mhm.
RSCX, so that the sponsors whose money we already have felt like they were getting their just due.
Yeah.
But after, that we started racing again in 2020, or whenever we got back into it, it just didn't feel uh,
Yeah.
like it did before we had a year off. And
Oh,
I
that's
think the
tough.
writing was on the wall. It was just time.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Wow, you had an
I did.
incredible run.
Well, I didn't think it would ever end, to tell you the truth. But um, when I started, all the riders that we had in our group were my friends and my racing buddies. Ultimately, I realized like everybody gets old, they get a job, they don't want to race anymore, and we get new
Yeah.
people. Before you know it, it's like the big brother to a lot of people who are maybe 15 years younger than me. And then I felt like, oh, now I feel like they're parents. And by the time it ended, there were moments that I felt like not only was I w- I was no longer their parents, I felt like their grandparents.
Oh, no.
And I also started feeling like a babysitter, because it was, um, I kept holding on to this vision that we had at the front end, where we're trying to do something good and support people so that if they are interested in racing, we could find some way to take 3, 4, 5, 6 people, create a structure within which they could, uh, have the easiest route to fulfilling any fantasies of being a racer
Yeah.
that they might have had. And then basically it was like, okay, it's time to go. So,
I mean, looking back, like what was in the and let's say in the really good years that you had, like what made up the essence of it being a great team or club? What are some of the elements? I love
well,
sort of looking at that because I'm involved with a number of clubs in this area. And what were some of the secret ingredients?
when I look back and really try to examine it over like a 44-year period, as much as I love the successes that we had, uh, particularly in the teen years, we had successes earlier too,
Mm.
but by the time the teen years rolled around, and we were already like kind of a brand by then, and it was amazing that for the amount of hustling that we once did in like the 90s or the early aughts, to just get like a few $1,000s from some entity to help the cash flow.
Hmm.
Um, by the time the teens rolled around, we were like middle five-figure checks we were getting regularly. Um,
Nice.
that's a lot of money, and before
Yeah.
you know it, it's like we don't really have a care in the world. All we have to do is go to the races and do the best we can, and the riders were doing that. But ultimately, I think having so much money and so many resources at our disposal, our family of brands, if you want to call it that,
Uh,
I feel like it just kind of like changed the dynamic of how the riders that are in the
uh,
fold related to the bigger picture. There were
oh,
some
interesting.
times when they seemed to expect it. There were some times when you have X amount of tires or X amount of skin suits or, X amount of cash for travel or hotels that the only thing that you'd hear was, "Oh, can we get another skin suit or another 4 tires, or, can we stay at a better hotel?" Um, this was not a daily occurrence, but I feel like, we got a little used to
Yeah.
having everything that we needed. And I
Hmm.
think by the time COVID hit, and we resumed, I don't really talk about this much, but um, COVID was really like a dividing uh, line also between the amount of sponsors and who they were,
Uh,
and everything that we needed to use their money for to support. I stepped in, and when COVID ended and we started racing again, and all those big checks that we used to get from like corporations, like whether it's Nokia or
uh,
RGM watches or uh, whoever,
uh,
it doesn't really matter, XYZ company. I decided to write them myself. So I was already like doing the bikes and the clothing, doing all the administrative work with Deb, my wife,
uh,
and then also writing like middle five-figure checks. And I'm a frame builder. It's like I don't live on noodles, and I don't have debt or anything. Things are going well with my business, and I've
mm,
worked really at least hard and long so that this is the case. But,
uh,
when I start writing the checks that are like I described, five figures, and they have to like go over the course of a 5 or 6 month racing period, uh, things seem to take a different complexion when
hmm.
the,
Yeah.
the the whole isn't working as smoothly as
I
you
understand.
remember it. And before you know it, it's like, okay, I'm done. So good memories.
Wow.
But
Good
the thing
story.
is, yeah, nothing lasts forever.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I've had fond memories of just watching the team excel and just see how you guys operate. It seemed like a sort of like a professional, team in the midst of our little amateur grassroots races sometimes.
well,
Um,
we, I don't know where we'd be today if COVID hadn't really been like a demarcation point for some of the things I'm talking about, but it was. And
yeah.
now I'm happy to just write a nice check to Jeremy and Jed for Project Mayhem and support the sport that way rather than having to micromanage uh, 5 or 10 human beings.
Let's chat about Project Mayhem. So this is, correct me if I'm wrong, this is a cyclocross series in Connecticut that you're sponsoring?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that I'm the title sponsor. I do it to continue the work that I started back in 1980 when my friend said, "Hey, you want to, sponsor us?
Mm-hmm.
It's your club too." And I said, "Yeah." So it's all one big agenda. Um,
It's awesome.
I don't really want or need anything back from it, but I do want to feel that I started in the club system. I started racing in the early 70s in like training race series
Uh,
that probably still exist in one way, shape, or form. But everything was more community based rather than, you know, um, you go to the races and everybody sits in their like sprinter van with their like Oakleys on, and nobody talks to
That's
one another, and it's like a bunch of like there's so much attitude that you can slice it with a knife. I wanted to return to something that seemed a little bit more humanity based, and Jeremy's a pal. Um, when I got wind of the fact that he was trying to create an umbrella organization under which like 8 races or maybe 8 or 10 races existed, I felt like, hey, this is like a perfect match for me and my checkbook. So that's it.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for doing that. I got to check out one of those races. I love that those series still exist in New England.
Oh yeah, no. So I've been through a few. I've kind of started to enjoy my weekends at home uh, as opposed to like 45 or 50 years worth of traveling every weekend.
Yeah.
So I haven't been to like every event, but the ones I've been to, it's so heartwarming to see people uh, seeming to have a nice time racing their bikes without uh, like this, like there's a certain element in the sport
Mhm.
that people have this holier than thou attitude, and they don't want to talk to you, or they don't want to
Yeah,
give you
yeah.
advice, or don't I'm kind of in my zone. Leave me alone. I'll see
Mhm.
you at the race
Yep.
start line. It's like I don't want that. I don't need it, and I don't see any of that in Jeremy series. So
Awesome.
yeah.
So for someone like myself who's admired your bikes from afar for so many years, what does the process actually look like for ordering one? Does it start with a conversation with Richard Sachs?
Yeah, basically, I've become email centric in the 21st century as far as my business goes.
Mhm.
At some point along the way, I concluded that the only sure way to have complete checks and balances with all the communications that could occur between a potential client or a committed client, uh, if they're an email, there's no second guessing like what you're supposed to do,
Mhm.
who said what. People email me through my website or however, and they ask me a few general questions, and I say, look, it takes this long, it costs this much, and if you're interested, I have 2 boilerplate docs that I could forward you, and if they get the forward and they agree to like the terms of business,
Mhm.
we're good to go. They just send me a, a small deposit, and sometimes I don't even care about the deposit. It's just a fiscal handshake. They fill out the form that I have, and then they wait.
Is there a secret sauce that goes into these bikes for, let's say somebody gives you their dimensions and tells you what
Yeah.
type of rider they are. Like, do you have like a little bit of sort of craftsmanship that you put into it for that type of rider?
No, everybody gets the secret sauce, and I'm glad you asked that question because going back to the original conversation about the materials and the tools and the mood and
Mhm.
the expectations, but I feel that just like the discussions and the uh, examinations of let's just say 17th century uh, Cremonese violins and violas, and
Mhm.
there's always somebody who's going to talk about the varnishes and the fact that we don't know. These men didn't leave a lot of documentation to speak to why, after 300 years, the wooden instruments that they make are
Mhm.
so precious or so renowned or have a certain sound. I feel like the human element, me, and the order in which I decide to go from like the beginning to the end and everything in the middle is something I've been working on for, at this point, 54 or 55 years. And that is really the secret sauce. There's not like one particular um, task or one particular type of tool or one uh, tolerance level that makes everything else what it is. It's the whole stew of uh, paying attention to
Hmm.
everything that's on my bench and realizing that even if something does go a little sideways, that too is part of the whole. And I think that um, the sum total of this is what makes the bike the bike. So they're not going to be inspection grade perfect the way a mold bike should be, because
Hmm.
if you put a bunch of goop in a mold and you take it out later, it's going to be exactly like, I call them
Yeah.
waffle iron bikes because I'm really catty and I'm near the end of my career and I don't care what people think. But I just think that this is part of what drives the bike, what drives me to make them, and with hope the client senses all of that when he or she assembles it and takes it down the road. So,
Wow. Well, when you think about, you mentioned you might be coming towards the end of your career. I mean, when you think about your legacy now, what do you hope endures most? Is it the bicycles, the aesthetic, your philosophy? Like, what do you think
well,
about when you think?
I don't really think about end game. So like I
Okay.
used that phrase before, the end of the road. Uh, I got a lot of work. I don't think I will stop. I can't imagine why I would stop. I'm healthy. I got my own material, so like I'm not dependent upon
Uh-huh.
other companies to supply me. And if they go out of business, like what am I gonna do? So I kind of like took care of that like 25 or 30 years ago. Uh I like being at the bench, so I'm gonna keep making bikes. But the legacy, like what people say or think, like that's up to them.
Yeah.
I'm just here, like swinging tools and doing the best I can. And if anything, I I'd be happy if like um my story inspires other people to consider the fact that they don't have to work in a cubicle, they don't have to go to college,
Uh-huh.
they could do stuff by hand, they don't have to be indentured to like a weekly paycheck. Um, there are other ways to go through life that have nothing to do with the traditional conventional path that most young Americans seem to get funneled into. So, um,
That's a great point.
it's,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
It's
just
true. I
that's
love
just the
that.
way I'm hardwired.
Are there a slew of Richard Sachs apprentices floating around or
No, I have trained a bunch of people.
uh,
At least three of them have worked alongside me in various shops I've had over the years, but none of them have lasted either in my shop or I don't even think in general because
uh,
this is a really strange business to be in because we live in like to use this term again, we live in a waffle iron world now. Everybody wants something just like what Woot won on Sunday with, or what Marianne Vos won. Everything
uh-huh.
now is so different
Yeah.
that to become in like this era a person who makes things by hand for the love of it, it's almost like, uh,
It's very
uh,
rare.
yeah, it's very rare. So, if I could rub off on one or two people and then they could take the ball and run with it on their own, that's fine. But as far as, the next in line goes, we all have to live in with the baggage that we inherited when we showed up. So like I'm one of these guys who showed up in the late 60s, early 70s as a teenager and
Uh-huh.
just stayed. I think the success or the momentum that keeps me here is part of the long line of like staying true to my original ethos. But if you're starting now in 2026 or even 10 years ago in 2015 or 16, um, I'm not really sure what that person's ethos would be because he didn't see the world through the same lens that I did. He
Uh-huh.
didn't see like every bike in the world was handmade and the better ones were more beautiful and more
Uh-huh.
and better made than the factory ones. these people, these young men or women, live in a world where everything is manufactured rather than made.
Yeah.
And I realize the term manufacture has its roots in making,
Hmm.
but we live in the industry, the trade, everything is uh, uh, there's a corporate entity tied to all of it.
Yeah.
So like I don't really know how somebody in the Y2K era uh, might survive in the what we call the frame building business.
Hmm.
But when they ask me, I give them advice. If they want to come uh, see how I do stuff, that's no problem. I have like 30 years worth of images on Flickr and in my website that are process shots that show what happens when I do something at a bench. So like I could refer people to the galleries or the albums or take a reel and do stuff at my bench. But at the end of the day, from 1975 forward, um, what drives me is to just hear my own voice. I don't actually talk to myself, but I
Yeah.
definitely know what I'm thinking, and everything else becomes a distraction. So while I've had people, come and go in my personal space through the years, um, it was really more of a 3 months here, 8 months there.
Hmm.
Go home and do stuff at your own workbench and come back and show it to me. This for me is a solitary pursuit.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So, Richard, I want to finish up with one softball question, but I'm really interested to hear it because you basically grew up in New England. Do you have a favorite New England gravel mountain bike road loop that you just love going to,
Well,
or an event?
I used to love going to nearly all the events. I had a soft spot for a lot of the UCI races that were south of the George Washington Bridge,
Hmm.
and used to love going to Charm City in Baltimore. Uh, Gloucester was a good one in our
Yeah.
neck of the woods. Uh, there are a lot, but by the time like everything kind of matured, to use that word again,
Hmm.
the events seem to be um, they seem to be like too big. There were too many events on a given day. When they started
Yeah.
charging for parking, it really changed the dynamic of like the ease of showing up and putting up your tent or your
Hmm.
tents. Uh, it got a little like uh, what happened to our little community? It's like everybody wants to be like Woodstock or some
Yeah. Yeah.
major league promotion. And I don't know. I kind of felt like the Mac series down in south of the Hudson River.
Hmm.
They seem to, by comparison, maintain their level of humanity more so than up here. But that's
Hmm.
just me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't have a license anymore. So like, who am I to have an opinion? So
Yeah. Where can folks find you? What's your website?
it's richardsachs.com. I have a fairly active Instagram, which is at the Richard Sachs. Um, or my website has an email uh, that people can use if they want to click through, but it's easy to remember. It's the Richard Sachs at gmail.com.
Perfect. We
So
will
yeah,
definitely add those to the show notes. Richard, this has been such a pleasure. I'm really excited that you took some time out of your day. For the longtime cyclists, like I mentioned, I think this conversation will feel like a tribute and not a very long tribute, but a little bit of a tribute to your life and your craft. For the younger listeners, I hope they took something away from it. It's sort of a real introduction to thinking about not only bicycles, but maybe even work itself, like you mentioned, that you might not hear every day. So, thank you so much for sharing your story. And thanks everybody for tuning into this episode of the podcast. Until next time, get out there, enjoy the warmer weather and the beautiful terrain of New England. So, thank you, Richard.
thank you so much. Okay.